recordings in progress. I am Charles Shapiro, the president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And I want to welcome everybody tonight. This is very noisy in my house, for which I apologize. This is a members forum, which means we've limited the enrollment to people who are actual members of the World Affairs Council, so that you can keep your cameras on if you wish, and you can ask questions directly without having them filtered by the moderator. And to do so, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a smiley face with a plus mark. Click on that, and one of the things that drops down where it says reactions is raise hand. And if you raise your hand, Amanda Mattingly, who's going to be our moderator tonight, will call on you at some point around 6:30. I'm going to get off, and just to make sure everybody knows, this is Afghanistan in Context, and our speakers tonight are Dr. Carrie Lee, Associate Professor at the U.S. Army War College, Jon Lee, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the city. And if you have any issues about the city or that you want to raise with him, please save those for another day. Okay, Amanda, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Shapiro. I appreciate it. And yes, welcome to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I'm Amanda Mattingly. I'm chair of the Members Forum Steering Committee here at the Council. And so we put together the Members Forum events. And today's August Members Forum is about Afghanistan. I'm trying to put Afghanistan into some context. We've invited two speakers tonight, as Ambassador Shapiro just said. We have Professor Carrie Lee and we have Jon Lee. I think, I'm not sure if Charles mentioned, but Carrie is an associate professor and chair of the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. And Jon Lee, in addition to being the Chief Operating Officer of the City of Atlanta, he served as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army, the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Is that correct, Jon? Yep. And deployed twice to Afghanistan. So both Carrie and Jon are Truman National Security Project Fellows, and both of them have spoken with us in the past at past Members Forum events here with the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. So we're so excited to have you all back. And some of you may actually remember that Jon spoke with us back in August 2017 for the Members Forum, where we talked about Afghanistan, and he was here with his father, Ken Lee, who also served in Afghanistan. So we thank you for your service and your family's service, Jon, and we're happy to have you back again to talk about Afghanistan. I know also a lot of you may have participated in the Council's flash briefing that Ambassador Shapiro held on Friday. And so we're hoping that this will be a continuation of that conversation on Afghanistan, and that we try to put it into some context here to help us to understand the war in Afghanistan, the withdrawal of troops, the current airlift evacuation mission that is ongoing. And I think that Professor Lee and Jon Lee will be able to give us some really great perspective on these issues. So thank you both for joining us. I'm going to start with some questions, and then we will open it up for Q&A with the members. And as Charles had said, please use the functions on Zoom so that I can call on you. You'll unmute yourselves and ask questions. So just to get this started, I wanted to ask you, Jon, first to start off with. I read Ambassador Ryan Crocker's opinion piece in the New York Times. It was published yesterday. I'm sure many of you also saw that. And in that piece, he argued that the Taliban now holds all the cards. And he said, quote, "American capitulation is already etched indelibly in the world's imagination." So I wondered, Jon, if you would respond to that and give your views. Did it have to end like this? From your perspective, and I know this is deeply personal, having deployed twice to Afghanistan, I wonder if you could share with us your reaction to that, and whether or not you think the war in Afghanistan was winnable, or was it always sort of a lose-lose proposition?
Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Ambassador, for having me back. I always appreciate the opportunity to join this group, such an amazing group, always great discussion. And, you know, that is a difficult question for me to answer because, after having spent many years in Afghanistan and having developed a great appreciation for the people, the culture, the places, I certainly wish things could be different. And I know we're all, disturbed, to say the least, about the images and some of the voices that we're hearing in Afghanistan right now. Personally, I feel lucky. My interpreter, he made it out of Afghanistan several years ago. He settled in Virginia, and he's got a beautiful family there, and I'm happy for him, and I'm grateful for his service to me and to the United States and to Afghanistan. But to directly answer your question, unfortunately, at the macro level, yes, I mean, it was likely to always be a difficult and messy process to withdraw. I mean, there's no question that we needed to enter Afghanistan, and we did so with a very strong coalition. The initial mission was accomplished within, about 2 months. Al-Qaeda was on the run, the Taliban had lost power, there was an interim government in place. And then really over the subsequent 19 years, we've struggled to clearly define or accomplish our mission. And, over those 19 years, there's certainly been ups and downs with points of hope for a self-reliant and well-governed country. And there are many things that, us as soldiers and our diplomats and our aid workers, our contractors, and certainly the Afghan people can and should be proud of from that time. But, when I was deployed to Afghanistan, which was 2006 through 2008, it was clear then, and that's now 13 years ago, that things were moving in the wrong direction. The security was deteriorating. The dependence upon the ISAF security forces was increasing, not decreasing. And so from my perspective, the strategic decision to withdraw was the right one. And, we probably should have tried to work through and figure out how to go through this difficult and messy process many years ago, how we withdraw, how we identify options to continue our political, military, and humanitarian support, but in a different way. And we're going through this process now. It's very painful. It was obviously poorly managed up front. And, I'm still very hopeful that it will ultimately turn out to be a successful operation. But, certainly Ambassador Crocker is, knows a lot about this region, knows a lot about the country. And I mean, he's right. They do hold a lot of the cards, and it's unfortunate we've ended up in this situation, but to some degree, it was unavoidable.
Thanks, John. Carrie, I wondered, we were talking about earlier about the images that we're seeing, and as Charles said, the voices that we're now hearing coming out of Kabul. And, they really are stunning. President Biden in July said that we would not see helicopters evacuating people from the roof of the US Embassy like we did in the fall of Saigon in 1975. And sure enough, last week we were seeing helicopters over US Embassy Kabul, and just really stunning images out of the airport. Carrie, you've spent your career looking at warfare, counterinsurgency strategy, humanitarian crises, intervention. And so I wonder if you could help us put this in context and compare what we're seeing and what we're learning to past wars. So the war in Vietnam, the war in Iraq. And if you could just help us frame this and compare, that I think would be really helpful for people.
Yeah, my first comment is I bet President Biden is regretting that choice of words right about now, and was last week as the images started to pour out. I think there's some important similarities between the conflicts, and I think that there's some important differences though as well, particularly when we talk about the future of Afghanistan. Obviously, there are similarities in how the U.S. approached each conflict. There are similarities in the governments, in the types of governments that we collaborated with, the difficulties of operating with regimes and players, the government in South Vietnam, the Iraqi government, the Afghan government, governments that largely weren't legitimate in front of their people, governments that large portions of which were incredibly corrupt and did not make reliable partners and allies on the ground. In this, I think we can say that these three conflicts are very similar and probably contribute to what Jon sees, which is kind of the inevitability of US withdrawal without victory, without reliable partners on the ground in the form of that host government. It becomes really difficult for you to achieve any kind of peace, right? Any kind of durable peace. Where I think the conflicts differ actually is in how they ended, right? And in the government that took over in the aftermath. Here we see three very different outcomes. In the case of Vietnam, you see a South Vietnamese army and government collapse that's taken over by a coherent state in North Vietnam, and that imposes their own form of government and control over the people. But you don't see any kind of internal divisions. I mean, you see plenty of internal divisions, but not the kind of outright civil war, not a lot of ungoverned spaces, right, in Vietnam post 1975. The North Vietnamese government ends up exerting quite a bit of control over that country, and it contributes to both internal and kind of external stability in the region. In Iraq, you had a government that couldn't control its borders and couldn't control its spaces, and so this leads to the rise of ISIS and things like that. But it remained a partner government with the US in some respects. And so we were able to come back in and help push out ISIS and help to establish some stability. So that is in itself a very different outcome, right, than what we saw in South Vietnam. And that provides more room for maneuver for the United States. I think we were hopeful that we would see that kind of situation in Afghanistan. Instead, with the rapid collapse of the national security forces there and the national army, the takeover of the Taliban in Kabul, what I think we're much more likely to see is the onset of civil war, because the Taliban is not great at governing. And so what I think we're going to see as an outcome here is a lot of different factions inside of Afghanistan, a lot of contested control in the country, and civil war-like outcomes. And so these are kind of three very different outcomes that have different implications for how we think about international security.
Well, that gets me to my next question, Carrie, also to you, which is, can you debunk some of the myths about the war in Afghanistan for us, and then help maybe us put a different frame on this, or what you might think would be more useful as we analyze what has happened over the last 20 years and what's happening currently?
Yeah, so the first one, going back to my comment about the partner nations, I think there's a myth out there that all three of these wars are examples of strategic impatience on the part of the United States, that we just don't have the stomach for long wars and we don't have the stomach to keep our troops in. If anything, I think 20 years in Afghanistan suggests that we have quite a bit of patience over 4 different administrations, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. We have quite a bit of strategic patience when we're dealing with such an unreliable and corrupt host government that lacks any kind of legitimacy among its people. So I would say that the debate there really is, how long should the US stay in wars and interventions when its partner nation is unreliable, weak, and corrupt? That's really the debate that we should be having. It's not whether the US can sustain intervention. It's not whether the US can, for domestic political reasons, sustain troops in, say, Korea or Japan or Germany, right? That's not the discussion we're having. The debate really is whether, how long can we or should we stay when the host nation is unreliable. The second myth that I would point to, is this saying that goes around that says Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires and could therefore never be governed. This is a common saying. I think it's based on a very selective reading of history. And in reality, for centuries, right, you're dealing with, yes, a tribal society and yes, a very mountainous terrain, but for centuries, Afghanistan was a pillar of development and culture in Asia. It was part of and contributed to multiple empires throughout history, even modern history. And so I would argue really that the debate here is that how do you fight a war without support of its border countries, right? The biggest problem with Afghanistan was not the terrain or the people itself. It was that the fighters, Taliban fighters, found refuge in Pakistan. If you had a strong Pakistani government that was willing to crack down on the Taliban and actually not even tacitly support them, this conflict ends very differently. And I think that was clear when the Obama administration did its strategy review in 2009 and 2010, thinking about the issue. Pakistan was really their key, and what they identified as being key strategically. It's not because Afghanistan is somehow ungovernable. It's that the border and the surrounding countries were unwilling to support the US and Afghan effort. I'll stop there and let you move on.
Thank you. That's interesting. And that the issue of strategic impatience is something that comes up in that opinion piece that Ambassador Crocker wrote yesterday. Jon, this is for you. I wonder when it comes to the final analysis here of the war in Afghanistan, the 20 years, with the decision to withdraw, the way that we've exited. I wonder, what do you think are going to be some of the key lessons for the military, for our intel services, and for policymakers going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's going to be a very strong, hard look at how we would enter situations where we are doing, longer term counterinsurgency, nation building type efforts. And, there are many examples that people more intelligent than me who've done more analysis of this than I have could provide of places where we have very deliberately chosen not to do that. And so I think, anytime we are going to choose to do that mission, for military leaders who obviously there's a generation of many military leaders who have grown up with that being a core doctrine of the way that we trained, of, the kind of way that we think about a core part of our mission. I think there is certainly a relook at that in terms of, especially for the conventional military, because certainly we have amazing capability in our special operations around how we do that mission, and will continue to do that mission in conjunction with, many other government agencies, and in a limited, focused, targeted effort, and do that globally. But for our conventional forces, which ultimately, when you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, we were training our conventional forces to do more unconventional type warfare with counterinsurgency. And so I think that is going to be, one of the critical questions that we ask ourselves moving forward, is whether or not we're going to continue to, one, train our conventional forces for that mission and deploy them for that mission, and certainly how we make commitments, in other countries for periods of time with that mission. And, there are many things that we transitioned that I think we're still trying to determine how we transition back, or how we have a hybrid in terms of training, in terms of the way that we have these, brigades that have been specifically stood up that are more oriented towards that mission. And so, that question, I think the military is going to be grappling with, is already grappling with, and we're going to face, for a while, building upon the lessons learned from Afghanistan. And I think it's obviously a key lesson for our policymakers as it relates to what, how we make those decisions. And, it's clear that when you look at the decision makers that were, making the decision when we went into Afghanistan, when we went into Iraq, and over time, I mean, some of it is just different philosophies. I mean, President Biden had a different philosophy many years ago than some of the people that were making decisions, 10 years ago. And so some of it is just their kind of fundamental belief, and that, ultimately is going to be dependent upon the policymakers' philosophy. But there are some recent lessons learned that I think will certainly inform them. And there are certainly some critical lessons learned for our military and intelligence leaders that will inform the way that we decide to train and deploy moving forward.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Carrie, both of you. I'm going to open it up now for a Q&A from our members. So if you'll just raise your hand using the Zoom function, I'll be able to call on you, and you can unmute yourself and ask Carrie or John or both of them a question. And I see Sandy first.
Okay, got it. I was a lieutenant commander attached to the 2nd Marines during the Vietnam War in a non-combat position. The first thing we learned and the first thing we had to adhere to, we don't leave our Americans behind. Could I hear some comments on that? And whether it's myth or not, the last I heard was that the Biden administration acknowledged that there are 8,000 Americans that they can't get out. And we've heard estimates much higher than that.
So I'll start, and John, you can follow up. Every report that I'm hearing on the ground says that every charter flight, every American plane leaving Hamid Karzai International Airport is absolutely prioritizing American citizens. It's a little bit of chaos down there, and so as you can imagine, and so getting American citizens into the airport and finding them to put them on planes is a logistical challenge. Every report that I'm seeing, though, is that Taliban at their checkpoints are allowing blue passport holders, right, U.S. citizens, to pass, people with green cards to pass through. Folks at the gates are prioritizing those people, and that planes and flights out are prioritizing them. So I think that the reality on the ground is that American citizens have a green light to go to the airport and get on a plane as fast as they can get to Kabul. The question is, what happens to the people we can't reach or who can't get to Kabul? There are other efforts, I think, that are ongoing with that. But it's one of those things where I think there is a deep commitment to grab American citizens and make sure everybody leaves, but the logistics are the ones that are, of locating people are proving really difficult to manage, and really difficult to identify.
The only thing I'll briefly add is it does seem like a significant miss that, months ago we didn't start to identify who the Americans were in the country, because I mean, and my hope is that there's people who have a lot more information than what's being put on the news around our knowledge, but because it seems like, we don't have much insight as to who the Americans are that remain in the country. So I'm hopeful that there are people who know a lot more than what is being put on the news. I do feel very confident that, our military and our diplomats and others and the president supporting that will do everything they can to get all of our Americans out. And, I think to Carrie's point, it seems like we're in a good position now with the agreements that have been made with the Taliban. But to me, the big miss was how did we not do more to capture information on who was in the country?
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yes, thank you. It does lead us to wonder where were the hundreds of contingency plans ahead of time. But Charles, you have a question.
I do. I got a question. And first I got a comment as a former State Department guy. Is to the people in the audience, when's the last time you made a foreign trip that when you got there, you went online and told the embassy you were there? I mean, the embassy doesn't know that you're there. Carrie is the exception, unless you tell them that you're there. There's American citizens in Haiti who were caught up in the earthquake who, the embassy doesn't know they're there. And anyhow, so that we don't know is not surprising because we don't know how many Americans are in any country in the world, even in dangerous countries. I'll stop. My question is this, and I'll let Carrie or John answer, but there's a sort of a back wave now, people saying, well, we should just have kept, there'd be a small price to pay to keep 3,500 special forces and intel officers in Afghanistan indefinitely. That the level of casualties that we've been taking is very low. And that if we stayed indefinitely, the cost we would pay would be small compared to the benefits in terms of US's reliable partner around the world, in terms of Pakistan and India busy figuring out right now what to do, and that the price for that would be well worth the cost.
So I'll take a stab at this. Or John, do you want to go first? Because I went first the last time.
No, you go first, Carrie.
Okay. I have two responses to this. The first is that it's not totally clear that we could have just kept 2,500 or 3,500 troops in country in the height of the fighting season, that it would have required actually an additional deployment of US forces. We would have had to escalate rather than just maintain steady state. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I find that compelling on the surface from what we know about the stretch of the fighting season in Afghanistan, that in order to hold ground and maintain territory late into August or September, we would have had to add more troops, which is very clearly, not what the Biden administration wanted to do, and not what folks on television are saying right now, right? That there's this kind of myth that we could have just, you can have steady state forces and it would have been fine. I'm not convinced that the situation on the ground was sustainable as it was. The second reaction that I have to that is that the people who are saying this are also the folks who led a war to which the American public was largely ignorant, and they are comfortable conducting foreign policy in a way that is largely without oversight from the American public. And I think there's something inherently problematic about that. That when you have 10 years of war or 20 years of war, and at the end of 20 years, a poll of Americans shows that the vast majority of them don't even know that we're in Afghanistan anymore. And what's more, they have no opinion about it. I think there's something really wrong when you don't have public oversight of a conflict or public investment in war. If we're sending American men and women overseas to fight, the public should be invested in that, because that's part of our democracy. And that's part of the commitment that we make in a democratic society. So I think there's a feasibility part that I question, but there's also a normative part where should we be conducting operations, kinetic violent operations overseas without any public oversight whatsoever, or knowledge or caring.
I'll just add that, I mean, to Carrie's first point, a little different than feasibility, but I just don't see how it changes anything in terms of what's going on now. I don't see how it changes the Taliban's ability to take over the country. And so with that in mind, I mean, we would have had 2,500 troops, in the airport, as we have more than 2,500 troops in the airport now. And, okay. The other thing is, I believe that we have significant capabilities in the region, and it's not the same, but I think we do have significant capabilities in the region that, when we need to partner with what would have been the Afghan government, we would have been able to do so and bring in capabilities. So I just don't see how it necessarily changes what's going on now.
Thank you both. I see a question from Fenton May. Fenton, can you unmute yourself, please?
I think. I have a question looking forward, and that is in the last 20 years, and this is a non-military consideration. We've empowered a lot of women, both adults and let's call them school-aged girls, to think of themselves as equals, which they rightly are. We've had a large number of scholarship programs and education of people as engineers and so forth, who are not necessarily going to leave Afghanistan, although they may be marked as having gone to university in Europe or the United States. I would believe those people, as Afghan civil society evolves, and I think, Carrie, you said you saw a civil war consideration, because within the Taliban, there's so many factions, and it's really almost a franchise of terror. That the investment we've made in education and the empowerment of women ultimately will bear fruit in an evolved Afghan government. And that's not to say there's not going to be 2 or 3 years of extreme difficulty, but beyond that, what we've done should bear fruit. And I looked at the Fulbright program for one. There's been a lot of Afghan Fulbright scholars, including in Georgia universities, who've all gone back to Afghanistan. And one can hope that they stay and play a good role in a future administration there. And I'd be interested in anybody else's comments on the role of women going forward, because you can't unempower them. You can make it difficult, but they're there, they're empowered, particularly in Kabul. And the role of all the people that we've trained in engineering and computer science and other fields that are there. Thank you for letting me ask that question.
I'll just quickly agree with you, Michael. I mean, I think those investments are critical investments that we cannot take for granted. I mean, we don't know exactly how those will turn out to bear fruit for the country over the next few years, but for those individuals, I mean, I saw it when I was there. I mean, the impact it made on those people's lives, while we were there and since. I mean, it's incredible investments that we should all be proud of. The many countries that have invested in the training, in the empowerment, and I mean, there's obviously a lot of Afghans that have left and may not go back, and there are many Afghans that have gone back, and I think there is a strong hope that they will be able to bring change to their country, whether at the local level or at the national level. But those were very individual, personal investments that, I mean, we have to be very appreciative of. We can't take for granted. I know, many of them who I saw and spoke to, I mean, that amazingly appreciative of those investments.
I wish I shared your optimism about the impact that a lot of the better educated folks and actually, and I hate that I'm saying this, especially women, will have on the future of Afghanistan. I think if anything, it makes, like we saw the protests in the streets of Kabul, right? Wonderfully, incredibly brave women leading those protests. They put targets on their backs, right? Absolute targets on their backs. And even in the Afghanistan that the US supported, our supposedly empowered women were living in households where I know of one woman, her in-laws used to beat her because she stood up for women's rights, just, in the last several years. So I wish I shared your optimism about the ability of women to affect change. I think that with a regime as oppressive as the Taliban, with what I see as an impending civil war, as warlords vie for power, and the Taliban has problems governing, which they almost certainly will because they've been out of power for 20 years. The American money is gone. Services are about to dry up. Name your issue. I'm afraid that with domestic instability comes backsliding in a lot of these metrics that we care about, like literacy and education and all of that. So I'm not as, I'm just not as hopeful.
We have a question from Jennifer McCoy. Jennifer, hi.
Hi, yeah, thank you. This has been really helpful. I wanted to ask perhaps Carrie primarily, do you think that this case is a lesson from this case is a failure that we made a mistake in the beginning to humiliate the Taliban and not incorporate them into a negotiated peace, and instead just tried to wipe them out, and kind of adding to the strategy in Iraq, the debothification, thinking all the way back to World War I and the humiliation of Germany. Is this a basic lesson, or would that we should not humiliate a loser, or do you not agree with that?
I think it would be a basic lesson if that were actually the decision-making process that happened in the fall of 2001. From what I've been able to tell about the decision-making process, President Bush offered the Taliban a settlement. His offer to the Taliban was give up al-Qaeda, allow us to eradicate al-Qaeda, and you'll be fine. And we won't invade. And the Taliban said no. At which point the Bush administration, I don't think really had a choice. You had to go in. Now, the mistake, I think, was in the administration's subsequent diagnosis of what the international threat was, which rather than making it organization-based and terrorist organization-based, it became a regime-based threat, right? So you're either with us or against us, right? That's where I think the policy mistake was. In expanding that diagnosis, not to just one regime that was harboring a terrorist cell, and the terrorist organization was the real enemy and the real problem for the United States. It allowed us to then swivel to the rest of the world and, invade Iraq and, make a foreign policy that was largely regime focused. So yes, ultimately, I think you're right in seeing that the policy mistake in identifying leaders of countries or regimes in charge of countries and then seeking to oust them from power, that's not a sustainable foreign policy. But in that particular case, in the particular case of Afghanistan, I don't know that the Bush administration really had a choice after the Taliban rejected their initial offer. I would also say that the administration made a choice to nation build there, and that wasn't a foregone conclusion. You could have ousted the Taliban, instilled another government the way the United States has done for decades, that was able to, a strongman government, able to consolidate power or something like that. But we decided to stay and nation build and try to build a democracy in Afghanistan. And that wasn't a foregone conclusion. That was a deliberate policy choice that I think the Bush administration, I know the Bush administration did not appropriately appreciate the magnitude of.
John, did you want to add anything to that?
Nope, covered it well.
So I wondered, when we're talking about the initial mission in Afghanistan and obviously to go after the terrorists who attacked us 20 years ago this September, I mean, there's a lot out there right now that suggests that automatically the terrorism threat level has gone up. Do you agree with that?
I do and I don't, which is like the classic academics answer, and I apologize to everybody for that line right there. Yes, the threat of terrorism has gone up in the region. The lack of governance, you will have, again, ungoverned spaces in Afghanistan. You will have a lot of local grievance. You will have a lot of jihadist organizations move into Afghanistan. I think that is highly likely. What I have trouble seeing is that spreading in any significant way to Americans or the United States. Most terrorism is local. Most terrorism happens because of local grievances. The Al-Qaedas of the world are extremely rare. And the United States is much better today than it was 20 years ago about identifying those groups and going after those groups. And we don't have the reservation about going after those individuals and organizations that we did in the 1990s. And so I have a hard time seeing how the impending tragedy in Afghanistan, the current tragedy and the impending kind of struggle for power reaches the United States or Americans. It might reach Europe. It will almost certainly reach Pakistan and possibly Iran. It will cause some regional instability, I believe. But I'm not going to stake my life on it. Don't take me to the bank. But I think it's probably not likely that it affects the United States in any significant way.
I mean, the unfortunate thing is that I don't know how you would counter the point in terms of how we would empirically prove that it did or did not. So, I mean, it is an interesting discussion to have, but I think, ultimately, I mean, Carrie highlighted the fact we're in a very different place than we were 20 years ago in terms of our capabilities, in terms of our posture around terrorism and our focus on terrorism globally, our intelligence assets, our military assets to deal with terrorism. I think, if I mean, my concern would be much less about Afghanistan harboring terrorists that plan things in the United States or against Americans, but it would be more about how does this affect the region? And if the region does become more unstable, what does that mean for the populations in the region? How does that translate into, other groups being able to recruit people to do things because of that regional instability? And I mean, that's a potential issue no matter what, that we need to be thinking about. But yeah, I'm not convinced that this is necessarily a significant turning point for that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on what Jon was saying. The thing that keeps me up at night and has kept me up at night for, I don't know, 10 years or so are Pakistani nuclear weapons. And so if and when you get jihadist groups, terrorist groups, increasingly powerful non-state actors, I get worried when there's regional stability around Pakistan or regional instability, around Pakistan. And so that's the security threat that I worry about most when we talk about instability in Afghanistan. And some of the most powerful arguments I've heard in support of US forces staying involve having the US around to sort of keep an eye on what's going on next door.
Wow. Well, that'll keep all of us up at night now. Thanks, Carrie. No. It's fascinating. Unless there are any more questions, I think we've come to our time, and this has been really fascinating discussion, and it really has been super interesting, and to hear from both of you your perspectives from your studies and your research and your firsthand experience on the ground. We really appreciate it. So thank you all, and thank you all for the great questions and for coming. And I'm going to turn this back over to Ambassador Shapiro. Thank you all.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, John and Carrie. I've got a long list of questions that I'm not going to ask, but that I have to send you. But thank you. This has been great. I mean, there certainly is a lot to chew on here, and the Pakistan issue is one we really need to focus on going forward. To all of you who are, since you're all members of the World Affairs Council, on Thursday at noon, we have a program, Haiti, No End to Suffering. We just opened the registration for it. Please register. The panelists will be Jason Elliott, Director of Disaster Response from MAP International, a nonprofit here in Georgia that sends medicine abroad to disaster situations. Dr. Henri Ford, Dean of the University of Miami School of Medicine, and Nick Kaufman, who is the USAID Response Manager for the Haiti earthquake. It's going to be great, interesting. Please register and join us on Friday. We've got great programs coming up for the rest of this year. And you'll get all our emails with them, but I just want to point out that if Delta variant holds and everything, people come in person as they say they're going to, we're going to have the ambassador of Mexico the second week of October, the ambassador of France the same week in October, the middle of October. We're going to have the foreign minister of Quebec. And then in November, first week in November, we'll have the ambassador of Brazil. So we've got some great programming coming up. I want to thank you all, and please join us. And thank you again, Amanda. You do a great job of moderating always. Carrie and John, this is, I think, Carrie's third time talking to us and John's second time. So I want to thank you both. This is great. Congratulations, Carrie, to move to the Army War College, where you got it from a bigger and better job than at the Air Force War College. And John, good luck with the city of Atlanta. They need some help too. So thank you all, everybody. Have a good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.